So today I'm going to talk about what we saw last year in VR. And I'm going to go broad and fast. Along the way, I'll throw in some thoughts on the future and a couple of tips. One thing is, I do tend to talk a little fast. I know not everyone's an English speaker, so if I'm talking too fast, feel free to kind of raise your hand. I'll try to slow down. I'll try to remember that, but we'll see. All right, so first, I know this audience is made up of a lot of different developers from a lot of different platforms. So in case you don't know Steam or you're not familiar with Valve, we've been making games since 1996. We also operate Steam. It's a leading PC platform for digital content with tens of thousands of pieces of software, games, and movies. And it's consumed by hundreds of millions of people over the years. And right now, we already have over 1,000 VR titles. We're also one of the early innovators of the hardware innovators from this generation of VR. So this picture is what was called our tag room. And it was back in 2013, we showed what was the first room-scale virtual reality using modern components such as low-persistent displays and full positionally tracked head. We're also working with companies like HTC on the Vive, and we're currently licensing our Steam VR tracking for free, and that's the same tracking that the Vive uses. And along with numerous hardware and software developers, we're working with the Kronos Group Open Standard Initiative to create a standard for virtual reality. Our goal there is to help stop fragmentation among the various different VR systems. That's Valve. For myself, I normally make games. I'm probably best known for the Left 4 Dead series, where I was project lead for Left 4 Dead 1 and 2. If you're not familiar with that, that was a 4-player zombie co-op shooter released in 2008 that's gone on to sell over 20 million copies across the 2-game franchise. But today, I'm talking to you with what I've been working on lately, and that's VR, and the work I do with third-party developers. So before I begin, I just want to remind you, everything I'm discussing today has a bias. Right? Virtual reality is new, so we don't know what we don't know yet. And we're still learning, and with all things, we start with what's easy. That means we come with a bias. Now, why is that important? Well, I always think of pre-internet. Hollywood needed an animal star, so it chose dog. Right? If you went by dogs, or you went by Hollywood, dogs are the most popular pet. Right? Thousands and thousands of movies feature dogs. The world is dog crazy. Cat people had that darn cat. But then it wasn't until the internet and sites like Reddit started showing what people really wanted, cat pictures, that the cat picture craze was born. So it seems Hollywood wasn't choosing what was popular based on actual popularity. They were choosing out what was easiest to train for their movies, right? They needed they needed an animal that would stay in the shot, do tricks, and you just can't get a cat to do that, so they chose dog. Now, if you had made your choice on what pet food to manufacture based on Hollywood's bias, you would have missed half your market. And so that's something to think about with everyone talking right now, is we're all just starting with what we know and what's easy. So you may have another idea that's just not held back by our current bias. And your way may be the future. So I just want to kind of frame everything I'm saying as this is what we've learned so far. I'm not saying this is how it's going to be forever and ever. This is just where we are after this first year. So why VR? I'm not asking why make VR, but this is the question that every good experience asks and answers. Why am I making it in VR? Because you have to think about it, for someone to experience VR, they've got to put on a headset. That's some friction. They have to want to have that experience. So you want to make sure that that experience kind of delivers for them having to do that extra work. So if the experience doesn't need VR, why are you making it in VR? Like the worst reason is because it's the hot, new, flashy thing and everyone's doing VR. Customers are way more sophisticated than that, and they'll see through that, and your experience will do poorly. So make sure your experience requires VR. So what does that mean? Well, for us, the essence of VR really is immersion. It's that ability that you can put yourself in the middle of a scene and interact naturally. You're immersed in the experience similar to how you are in real life. And as someone making games, that's amazing. Right, so for Left 4 Dead, we always wanted to have you be immersed. We always wanted to put you into the world, but it's really hard with a 2D screen. So like in this example, these two guys here, if they were attacking you from behind, we actually slowly rotated them in front of you. Because it just wasn't fun getting picked apart slowly from behind when you didn't notice it. And you didn't notice it because you're playing on a 2D screen, you're looking through the avatar's eyes, you're controlling it with a mouse and keyboard or joystick. There's just a lot of abstraction in that system. And so good VR removes that abstraction. And that changes everything. So when you play a 2D game like CSGO, you might lean back or lean in towards the screen during a gunfight, You don't jump out of your chair or duck under the table. But play budget cuts? And that first time a robot aims at you, this is what she did, right? You might jump out of the way or even run into a wall. And what changed is that robot isn't aiming at somebody, her avatar on the screen. That robot is aiming at her. And so while you might laugh at the video, in reality is she bought into the world she was in, her brain was confused, and it did the first thing it thought of was like, I don't know what's going on, so let's just get the hell out of here and get to safety. Right? Our brain, with VR, good VR taps into that part of our brain where we just kind of uncontrollably respond to what's happening. And it isn't just about reaction. So this is Vanishing Realms. And it's how you interact with the world as well. And so this is a great example of, so this monster charges at you. Now, traditionally, you'd hit the B key, right? You'd block his blow as he comes in. But in Vanishing Realms, since you have motion controllers, you hold up one arm to block the blow, and then you counter and you time it with that. And it becomes this natural kind of combat system. You could do that because you have the track controls. And this makes combat physical. This is not about abstracting controls, but mirroring real-life world or real-world interactions. This also means you can get the players to be physical, right? They can exert themselves. And it isn't just moving around in this space, but for games like Audio Shield, pictured here, that moving around and that motion, you kind of can lose yourself in the experience. I mean, think about how we play most musical games now. We're holding some replica instrument in our hands, and we're looking across the room at a screen, and we're trying to match the notes. Here, Audio Shield removes that abstraction, and you're in the music. It ties those two things together in one place. And that becomes really powerful. And then remember with that about when we talk about putting players in the world and being able to do those kind of controlling of them, of having those things all happen at once, you have their undivided attention. That is super rare anymore in this world, right? And that means they aren't on their phone, they're not doing anything else. They are in your experience. So you need to command that. You need to reward players for that, right? So don't waste time with things like title scrolls or just non-interactive elements, because they're literally just standing around waiting for that to end now. You have to keep them engaged. A great example, super simple, is Punch Bomb. Game's called Punch Bomb. You punch a lot of things. So how do you start the game? You punch the start button, right? It's just really simple, really just keeps you engaged and goes. It doesn't waste your time. All right, so back to Job Simulator, the game I showed earlier. So this is a highly successful game. And, but the world the players are losing themselves in, you take a look at that, that's not realistic. It doesn't have to look real. That's the good thing about it is your brain's either really smart or really stupid, but really malleable. That you throw yourself in this world, and as long as it's a consistent world, you buy into it. You believe it's real. And so, you accept this cartoon world as you're in a real world. But that impacts developers in another way that you often don't think about. So we have a language of games. When you see this chasm in front of you, you know what to do. You jump, right? And there's a whole bunch of language we've learned of making games. But now, VR, you're actually tapping more into the language that we use in real world stuff. So things like architecture and affordance all become very important, and you need to think about those things. Because you want to meet players' expectation for interaction. Okay, so what should you make in VR now? I mean, one of the important things I always think is ask yourself what you can bring to it. What are you doing that's new? What are you doing that's better? Why should people play your game? So the strange thing, though, is if you describe Arizona Sunshine pictured here at a high level, it sounds like a bunch of other games. It's a zombie shooter. It's kind of wave-based. You'd think we have enough of those now, but they released and they're super successful. But that's because Vertigo brought something to the game. They brought themselves to the game. So they added a bunch of little touches that kind of show who they are and how they think about games. And they took their time to polish. That's really important right now, is if you can afford it, take that extra month or two, or weeks even, and just polish and make sure that you're adding those little elements to the world and into the game that players will really grasp onto. And make sure that you bring yourself to everything. It's just, I think with VR being so new, people want to rush and hurry up, and they think there's this gold rush where you have to get it done. These guys had first started showing this game along with Job Sim and everything else, and they released 3 or 4 months later, oh no, actually 6 months later, and it was still fine, right? There's still a market for it. You don't have to rush and be the first one out there. Okay, and one note on all the VR I'm talking about today's high end. And so right now that means positionally tracked head, standing in a volume with motion controls. Because today's high-end will become tomorrow's mainstream. If you really want to think about the largest addressable market, it's not about the number of headsets in any one platform today, but it's what's going to become the standard. So if you develop for the high end, you know then that you'll have the longest tail and you'll be able to kind of get the best off of your time and money investment. Okay, now I'm going to put games aside. I think probably that's what we know the best in VR right now, most familiar for most people. So I'm going to talk about some other applications we see in virtual reality that you might be aware of, or might not be aware of. Okay, but before I do, the one thing is, if you aren't familiar with games and you're making something in VR, you should become familiar with games. We've been working in this problem space for a really long time. It drives me nuts when I hear the Hollywood people talking about how they're going to bring stories to VR, and then they ignore everything we've learned about telling stories in game. Right? There's a whole bunch we've learned of how to control players' attention when they can turn anywhere and look at anything. And so you want to look to games for a lot of your interactions and a lot of how you build your systems. But okay, on the non-games. And so while it may seem weird, by the way, non-games for Valve, we actually work with a whole bunch of people who will never ever ship anything on Steam, and that's cool. Because we think for VR to succeed, it needs to be more than just one thing. It needs to be more than just games or experiences that are on Steam. And so we purposely spend some time trying to help these other experiences. And one of the first examples that we saw early on was design and tools to use inside of that can kind of take advantage of the full 3D. And so Tilt Brush is just a great example of one of the early tools that really shined. And if you're not familiar with it, you can do fantastic images like this. And the cool thing is not only can you walk around these images, but you can walk through them. And it clearly answers the why VR, because it just removes the 2D limitations that we previously had in our artistic tools. We also see this mix of content creation and consumption in VR. So a great example is Mindshow. You're actually in VR creating these little animated scenes, but you can consume them in VR, or you can consume them on YouTube or some other platform. So they're using the advantages that VR brings to it to create the content, but then having a bunch of other platforms being able to consume it. And some of this type of work is being used in ads. So this is from an ad Nissan created. This is an artist who's got this weird ability. If he sees something for a minute, he knows it exactly and can reproduce it. And so here he is using the Vive to reproduce a new car for Nissan. And so while this is an ad, we've also seen car manufacturers do real design work in VR. So until recently, even though it's a really high-tech industry, they've actually been using clay models because they needed to, before they could okay a car, they needed to be able to walk around it and see it from a bunch of different angles. And that's really hard to do on a 2D screen. Where in VR, now they can walk around, they can see the model, they can actually experience the car. So people like BMW and others are going all in on VR design of their cars now. Okay. Then at the launch of the headsets this past spring, we had one odd outlier on Steam, and that would have been the IKEA experience. I don't know if any of you have played it. But it actually makes sense. So did you know 75% of all the images in the IKEA catalog are digitally created? If you look at that catalog, you can't tell. It's indistinguishable from real life. And that's because they have this whole system where they're probably the largest storehouse of digital assets. They scan everything at 5 levels of photorealism. They have this entire factory essentially set up for every new item that comes in and how they scan it. So for them, creating a realistic 3D world was in their wheelhouse, and they were able to really kind of nail that. Because here's what most people had been doing up to that point, and even still now. When you're in the home remodeling, decorating, travel, kind of bunch it all together space. 360 images. It's still a popular thing to produce, but maybe not always the most helpful. The problem with 360 is, in this case in particular, is a single point in space. No matter how fancy the camera, it's one point in space, right? If I put a camera here, sure you can see in all 360, but only from that one point of view, right? So if you're taller or shorter, it's the same image. You move back or forward, it's the same image. And that didn't work for IKEA, right? Because you lose your ability to move around, and more importantly, in this case, you lose scale and personal view. So does this cabinet block my view? Can I reach over the counter? Now, those are real questions you ask without thinking about it when you go shopping or when you go do a home remodel in your house. But so if we want to have those tools be more than a gimmick. They need to be able to answer real-world questions like that. And so the IKEA experience totally was able to do that. And now IKEA used a game engine. I think we're all familiar with these, slide from a non-game event. So you get to use these again in VR. And the cool thing is, what you've learned to do previously, you can use and do that with them now. If you haven't done VR, you can watch a 30-minute video on YouTube and you'd be up and running. It's that similar to how you've been working now. But back to the kind of trying to make realistic images, there's actually another way to do it. And so, at Valve, we're either doing full digital reproductions like IKEA, or we use a method called photogrammetry. And then photogrammetry, we actually capture a space by using a bunch of photographs from a standard camera and then lay it out onto geometry. Anyone with the camera can do this. It may look confusing at first. Here's one of our artists working on the lobby at Valve. But what we would do here is just keep refining of what he's working on until it's indistinguishable from the real lobby. And then that lets you have some fun. The cool thing is, your brain just, if the world you're sitting in is actually realistic looking, it just accepts everything in there as being real. So when we put a big balloonicorn running around in the space, you think it's real. And the reason I bring up this little side path is a bunch of people want to talk about what's failing, what isn't catching on, and it's often because we do the easiest thing instead of the best thing. So in general, right now, I see a bunch of 360 picture and video, and while there is a use for it, it's often being done because it's the easiest thing, not because it's the best thing, right? So don't let those limitations, biases, and failures stop you. Experiment and try things. See which should work for you. And that goes not just for photogrammetry, but all things in VR. You need to experiment and prototype. And the good thing with experimentation, especially at the beginning, is you don't need to take that journey alone. The VR community right now is open to sharing, so reach out, go to local meetup, share what you're working on, learn from others. I know there's a couple places in Berlin that are already doing this. I know you guys have meetups, so just make sure to attend those. And you can always mail me. I don't care if you're making games in VR or just other experiences in VR. I love to see what people are working on. I love talking about the projects, so feel free to shoot me a mail. So when I first started working on VR, this is where I sat. I gave demos. I gave demos for months and months. I was listening to everyone's crazy idea of what they were going to do once they got this technology themselves. And now this past year, I've pretty much spent the year traveling the world, getting to see the crazy things people have been doing. So you're probably familiar with the games. Here are some things you might not be. Well, this one you might be, Google Earth. So Google Earth is a great example of taking some existing data that already existed, that they already had, and presenting it to you in a brand new way. So thanks to that 3D data they had, you can now roam much of the world, all the way down from street view as a little guy there, all the way up to godlike from outer space. And being able to be Godzilla-sized and walking down a street gives you a whole new perspective about a city. So before I came to Berlin, I was walking around Berlin, trying to remember where everything was spatially. It just was a really good way to learn. And my Google Earth kind of splits that line between education, practical use, and experience. This is from Lifeek. It's full on education. There's a lot of different education apps coming up now. As you can imagine, learning changes when you can actually interact with objects and kind of experience what you're learning. Experiential learning is always better. And in this case, this is SuperChem, so it's also safer. You're not blowing up a lab, you're blowing up something virtually. And then there's ShareCare. This goes past education to personal, and they've got an app that actually gives you information about your own body. And this is from Precision VR, a surgical theater. It takes it one step further, and this is actually helping doctors study a patient before surgery. There's a TV show in the US, Chicago Hope actually featured this, and they talked about it like it was some crazy, crazy stuff from the future, but they're actually using it today. And there's others in the medical field like OssoVR, so they do actual surgical simulations with surgeons and nurses to practice in a surgical environment inside of VR. And looking to the future, universities and medical research companies continue to pioneer how VR will be used. Medicine's ripe for virtual reality, both for simulation and education. So this is a University of Washington, and this is about testing, having to give patients less pain medication because of VR. So there's just a lot of different things happening. All right, so now I'm gonna get into something specifically for the Vive right now. And some of these were built for the Valve's, using Valve's technology, Steam VR tracking. So we always saw VR as being more than being seated at your chair. So our tracking reflects that. This picture's the two little blue things up at the sides. Those are the base stations. Everything in that 5 meters across can be tracked, including not just the person, but other trackable objects. And a great example of this flexibility is this firefighting training rig. So it's expensive to train to fight fires. They were showing this at CES recently, and this is actually being used down in Australia. With this, they also have a jacket you wear so you actually feel as it gets warmer. But the hose is tracked inside the space, and you're in firefighting gear. And as mentioned about the tracking, that little bit at the end of the hose, that's what does the tracking. That's one of our trackers from HTC. You can get those now. And so the hose then is tracked in both the physical and virtual space. So not only does it allow an unlimited number of objects to be tracked, but they can be fast-moving objects. And it tracks them all with sub-millimeter level of accuracy. So Major League Baseball has captured every single pitch for the last 8 years. So Trinity VR created a system where it lets you actually bat against those pitches. So it's hard to hit a pitch by the pro, because it should be, right? They're pro baseball players, that's why we're not them. But this is a great use of existing data, because it just expresses that information that they had previously in a way different way. When you have a 100-mile-per-hour fastball coming at you, it's personal. You understand exactly then what it feels like. And that making it personal comes through in stuff like emblematic groups work. So this is Project Syria. And they put you in the shoes of a refugee. So they're mixing news, technology, and social awareness. We think this is important content. And while it's not like anything else on Steam, we want to encourage other people to create more of content like this. So if you're an artist, a journalist, or storyteller, come talk with me. Love to have this up there. We're getting more and more on there slowly. And then there's other people like Skip Rizzo. He's down at USC, and they're actually using exposure therapy in VR to help post-traumatic stress disorder for vets. We've seen it used both to help classmates of autistic students understand the problem of autism, and then for autistic students to help concentrate. And we've seen explosive growth in travel and architecture. Travel's pretty powerful when paired with things like photogrammetry, right? Because then it actually allows you to go to those places or to plan a trip for when you will go to them. And for architecture, we see companies using it to allow people to walk through their homes before they're completed, or do a kind of like a what if for a house remodel. And again, this is, if you do it with actual digital information versus a 360 image, you can actually get real information and understand the problems before you go ahead. The very first thing we actually ever did in Unity was one of the guys was doing a house remodel at Valve, and he brought in his plans, converted them over, and walked around in his house and got to see the problems of the house remodel. And that's actually the first time we did teleportation, because he had to move around his house and see how it would look. But now there's cool things like Prospect from Iris VR. This actually allows architects, homeowners, and builders all to communicate in the same virtual space instead of having to look and pore over plans. And so we see new things every day. So with the ability to add sensors to a model gun already used in training, military and police units can now train safely and cheaply, and while familiarizing themselves with the actual equipment they'll be using. And the future keeps bringing us new ways to interact. This is from Manus. These are gloves that give you finger-level fidelity. So while these may not become mainstream, they may have an application that you want to make that they would work perfectly for. And that kind of comes to one of the big points here. So people are always asking, what's the killer app for VR? You know, where is the killer game? Where is the Sonic? Where is the Mario? You know, but what was the killer app for the iPhone? I would say it was the flexibility, its ability to become something different for each person. I mean, 20 years ago, you would have asked me, what features would I want out of my phone? I bet you I would have said something about making phone calls. But, I mean, now I rarely make a phone call. Instead, it's about taking cat pictures, checking my mail, listening to music, ordering up a car on demand. And that's kind of where we are in VR right now, 20 years ago, just at the start. You know, so don't limit to what we know today. There's so much more. I mean, just now I didn't even have time for art or social or meditation or numerous other applications that we're seeing cropping up in virtual reality every day. You know, we are still so amazed by the easy things, the simple things, that we haven't even dreamed of the complex things. I mean, think about, like, Uber didn't come when the iPhone first came out. Uber came later. First, we just translated things that we knew on the PC to mobile. And we're kind of in that space now. We're translating what we know and game forms that we know to VR. Well, all of a sudden, we're going to start coming up with things that only could exist in VR once we become familiar with the space. But right now is a good time to get started. So, I've just scratched the surface on what people are doing. So, go out there and create. And when you start working on things and start creating, let me know. Love to see cool stuff. So that's it. Any questions?
Nice, thank you. Just a quick question, the tracker, the Valve tracker, when is it being launched and how can young startups, enroll for the chance to try them out or to...
For the tracker?
Yeah, for the tracker.
So HTC's running that. So this is sometimes always confusing as we work really closely with HTC right now. And so that's their tracker. They have a sign-up sheet. I think if you just search on HTC Vive tracker, it'll probably come up. There's a sign-up for it. It's not shipping in bulk yet to developers. It will be soon.
It's like 1,000 pieces there.
Well, 1,000 soon. We'll be showing some more. Yeah, we're showing some more people using it and some more things at GDC. I don't know if you've seen the video with the guys from Island 359. We're strapping controllers to their feet and other objects to try to do full body. And so they're actually going to get trackers. So we have some limited number now for GDC that we're giving out, but there'll be more after that.
A short question about the tracker. Does it has a vibration function, like for example when you hit the ball, that you feel it in the hand? Like,
They don't. Does the tracker have haptics?
it should be a really easy function.
So for instance, in the baseball one, they actually didn't add the haptics. So it's a cool thing. What they did was they just put a little mount that you can take any baseball, because they want to make it for pro players. Pro players want to use their bat, right? So it straps onto the bottom, and then you just screw it in. And they didn't want to add haptics there because they thought that would kind of throw you off where the noise and everything else is a kind of good enough indicator. And then kind of anything you're working in VR, it's like I always start with nothing and then keep adding to it, and you kind of see when does it become realistic. Like the first time people put haptics in when you pick something up, just kind of blew my mind of how real that felt.
Do you see any potential in the future of web VR? Right now it's usually criticized for performance issues, but in the next few years we might make that kind of irrelevant.
I mean, having a simple, easy, frictionless way to get to content is always helpful. I mean, we work with those guys who are doing it now. We'll see, but the problem you get there is of how big of experiences you want to download and how much you want to wait. As things become more and more kind of robust, that becomes problematic. But I mean, that goal of that is essentially why, from the get-go in Steam, we purposely made it where you never had to take off your headset. Anytime you had to take off your headset, that was fail. And so we wanted to be able to have you always be inside of that. So that's a good goal, and I think still for smaller apps, the web stuff is super awesome. I think just as what apps get bigger and bigger, that becomes problematic.
Last call. Okay, thank you. I believe there's a mixer somewhere outside. And